A continuación, se dará inicio a las conferencias magistrales 1 y 2, que cuentan con la moderación de la doctora Paula Muñoz. La doctora Muñoz es médico cirujano, neuróloga y doctora en ciencias. Es directora del Centro de Estudios Clínicos del Instituto de Ciencias e Innovación en Medicina, ICIM, de la Facultad de Medicina Clínica Alemana, Universidad del Desarrollo. Invitamos a la doctora Muñoz y a los expertos que participan de esta sesión como expositores y comentaristas que pasen a la testera para dar inicio a la sesión.
Muy buenos días y bienvenidos nuevamente a este seminario que comenzará con el primer módulo llamado Migración Internacional y Salud Global. Tenemos algunos minutos de retraso, por lo que vamos a privilegiar el tiempo en las exposiciones, tanto conferencias como comentarios, y probablemente tendremos menos tiempo para las preguntas. Vamos a comenzar entonces con la primera conferencia magistral del profesor Oliver Razum. El profesor Oliver Razum es decano de la Escuela de Salud Pública y jefe del Departamento de Epidemiología y Salud Pública Internacional de la Universidad de Bielefeld. Sus proyectos de investigación en curso se centran en la salud de los migrantes, las desigualdades sociales en salud, la salud pública internacional y la prevención y atención a grupos minoritarios. Oliver Razum posee un doctorado en la Universidad de Heidelberg y una maestría en epidemiología de la Escuela de Higiene y Medicina Tropical de Londres. Bienvenido, profesor Razum.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Paula, for this friendly introduction. Thank you also to Universidad del Desarrollo, and in particular to Dr. Valtika Cavieses for inviting me to Chile. It's a great honor for me to be here and to be able to speak to you this morning. How does migrant health affect population health or the health of populations? Before I'm going to discuss this question, let me provide you with some background information on migrants today and on what I call the new normality that migration has brought about in many countries. Here are some figures I collected from the United Nations website. And you can see here migrant figures for the world, for Chile and for Germany in 1990, in 2017. As you can see, in the world these days, we have around 260 million migrants. In Germany, it was 12.2 million migrants in 2017, and in Chile, about 500,000. I'm sure these figures have gone up in the past few months and years. But what you can also see is that for Germany, this is a long-standing process. Between 1990 and 2017, the migrant population doubled, but we already have about 15% of our population that has a migration background. In Chile, you can see that the numbers have multiplied almost fivefold, but still the proportion of migrants in the population is small. In the next 45 minutes, I will examine some aspects of this question: how does migrant health affect the health of populations? And I'm going to show you the two conclusions I will come up with. Number one is migrant health is an integral part of population health, and it should not be discussed separately or diverted from population health. And the second message I'm going to convey is migrant health, in particular in countries such as Germany, is affected by many missed opportunities and health governance deficits. A lot more could have been done for migrants, but unfortunately, this has not happened. I will base my argument on three underlying concepts or three underlying ideas. Number one is migrants experience health risks and develop health needs that may differ from those of the majority population of the destination country. And in the first part of my talk, I will show that a life course perspective can help to better understand the resulting health-related diversity or heterogeneity in today's societies. The life course approach also demonstrates the need to look beyond national borders when working in the field of immigrant health. In part 2, I will say more about the health-related heterogeneity that has become the new normality in most societies today. I will assess how health services deal, or using the example of Germany, for a long time have failed to deal with this heterogeneity. And I will show you this using the example both of migrants and of refugees. And then I will look at issues governing their entitlement and access to healthcare, so you get this governance aspect and its importance. While presenting my empirical data, I will also show to you that public health research and public health practice are not neutral. In other words, public health is not free from underlying normative agendas, or call them underlying mind frames, if you don't like this sociological terminology. I will present two normative agendas that often constrain research work on practice with migrants, on immigrant health, and worse, I will show you that researchers and practitioners may not even be aware that they are underlying these agendas and their constraints. They're not even aware of the constraints. The life course approach can also serve as a tool to become aware of such hidden normative agendas in immigrant health. In the discussion after my presentation or after the next presentation, we may have time to talk about language use when communicating about migrants and their health. This has become an issue since xenophobic attitudes and right-wing populism are on the increase in many countries, unfortunately also Germany. Let me introduce to you the life course approach to migrant health. Now, in this respect, we stand on the shoulders of giants, as the saying goes. Here is a seminal paper from the so-called Nihon San study, which Michael Marmot published almost 40 or more than 40 years ago. Michael Marmot back then looked at the coronary heart disease risk of Japanese people in Japan, that's the Ni for Nippon, of Japanese people who had migrated to Honolulu, that's the Hon, and that's a place still somewhat close to their country of origin, and of Japanese people in San Francisco, that's the San in the name of the study. What Michael Marmot found was that there is a gradient in risk of coronary heart disease for Japanese people, with the lowest coronary heart disease risk in Japan, intermediate risk in Hawaii, and highest risk are for immigrants from Japan to California. So from this study, a number of conclusions can be drawn. Migrants bring risks or bring health advantages from their countries of origin to the country or the target country of their migration. So past exposures in the country of origin are of relevance to the risk of immigrants today. Second, health-related risks may change during the migration process. This is pretty obvious from the increase in cardiovascular risk of Japanese migrants to the United States. And third of all, this is not only a biological phenomenon, it does have a strong social component, namely, in this example, the change in lifestyle. Some aspects that are relevant to the health of migrants, however, are missing from this research that Michael Marmot did more than 40 years ago. and that is the health of migrants relative to the majority population in their new home country is affected also by selection processes at the terms of migration and by access to health care. My colleague, please log on. My colleague Jakob Spalek and I have tried to sum up Michael Marmot's findings and more recent research in a life course model of migrant health. It illustrates how exposures before, during, and after migration affect immigrants' health. So you can see here the health situation of an immigrant. You can see here the timeline. So you have factors that act before migration, for example, genes and sex, factors in the country of origin, individual environmental factors, contextual exposures, factors leading to migration could be war, natural disaster, political repression, poverty, then factors in the process of migration and factors in the new home countries, again, individual as well as contextual factors. You can also see that, of course, the health of the second generation will be affected, but today I will only look at the first generation. And I will look at factors before, during, and after migration and how they may actually affect the immigrants' health. So before migration, you have here, for example, differences in the risk of chronic disease. Genetic disposition plays a role. You look, for example, at South Asian migrants to European countries. They have a different genetic disposition compared to the European population, have a higher probability or prevalence of intra-abdominal obesity. And this results in a higher risk of diabetes type 2 and as a consequence in cardiovascular risk, CVD risk, which is higher than in European populations. Immigrants from countries with a low hygienic standard have a higher risk of having been infected with Helicobacter pylori during their childhood, which brings along an increased risk of stomach cancer in adult life. At the same time, growing up in low hygienic conditions decreases their risk of allergies. So compared to populations in, let's say, European countries, immigrants from an African country would have a substantially lower risk of allergies. Immigrants from countries with a high prevalence of hepatitis B and C will show a higher risk of liver cancer later on in life in the host country of their migration. On the other hand, migrants who come from a country where they've been exposed to a low-fat diet and a lot of exercise due to lack of public transport will have a substantially lower risk of cancer, of colon cancer, and possibly also due to breast cancer. One should stress that many of these differences in risks are non-deterministic, meaning they are amenable to preventive efforts. So this is not fate, this is something that can be acted upon. Second of all, there are selection effects. Migrants tend to be particularly healthy persons and particularly courageous persons. These are the ones who migrate, and that means they have a lower morbidity, a lower mortality compared to the population in their country of origin, but also frequently a lower morbidity and mortality as compared to the population in the host country. And this is a bit of a paradox because migrants often live in conditions of a lower socioeconomic status than the majority population in the host country. So this is the so-called healthy migrant effect. And it's paradoxical because we would expect a higher mortality, a higher morbidity from many diseases due to the low socioeconomic status. There had been a lot of debate in the past what the reason for this healthy migrant effect is, and whether this is really due to the selection process at the time of migration. So there was a hypothesis that there was a selective return migration, that ill migrants would return to their home country and be treated there, not in the host country of migration. The so-called salmon bias, you know, salmons return to the place where they were born as far as that is possible for a fish, and die there. So there was the suggestion that maybe mortality of migrants was invisible because it happens in the country of origin again. However, there's by now substantial evidence that this is not the case, and that this is actually a true health advantage that migrants have. However, what has been observed is a convergence in chronic disease risks among immigrants and the host population. That means even if migrants have a mortality advantage, say in colon cancer mortality or in breast cancer mortality, this will decrease over time, and after decades, the risk of immigrants and the host population will have converged. There is not yet sufficient evidence to say something about refugees and whether they actually have a healthy migrant effect as well. And that is number one, due to a lack of data, and number two, because so many refugees that came especially to European countries were severely traumatized physically and mentally. Saying that, let me now come to the fourth point, and that is exposures during migration. And here is an extreme but timely example of exposure during migration. The International Organization of Migration, IOM, produces a simple but utmost depressing statistics in their so-called Missing Migrants project. And looking beyond our national borders reveals an additional and major public health risk for refugees, and that is unsafe escape routes. One of the deadly borders in this world is the EU's, the European Union's external border in the Mediterranean. And there have been 18,000 deaths, people drowning in the Mediterranean in the period from 2014 to today. And besides these 18,000 deaths, of course, those who survive will be heavily traumatized, both psychologically and bodily, and this trauma is very likely to affect their health later in their life course. So in this part one of my talk, I have shown to you the health-related heterogeneity or diversity of immigrant populations relative to the majority populations in their new home country. I've shown you the underlying reasons, and I've shown you that the life course model demonstrates the importance of exposures outside the destination country, be the destination country Chile or be it Germany. This life course model also shows the need to be clear about one's normative position or mind frame regarding the setting of migrant health research. Much of the research in public health happens entirely within what sociologists call the nation-state container. Initially, this may seem only natural. Nation-state is conceived as a fixed container of social relations and therefore thought to be the appropriate primary unit of analysis. This is how Nina Glick-Schiller puts it. She's a person who's very critical of this nation-state container approach. And the life course approach demonstrates that research needs to take a global health perspective. we need to investigate determinants of migrant health both outside and inside the nation-state container. Obviously, these two normative perspectives lead to substantially different research questions and designs. Whether you look at the health of migrants just within the nation-state container or also outside the nation-state container. And later on, to different public health interventions. Let me come to the second part of my presentation. And for this second part, I will introduce a second pair of normative positions. And that is, should all population groups in a country enjoy equal entitlements and equal access to healthcare? The underlying normative position would treat health and access to healthcare as a universal human right. This is the position taken by the United Nations in 1948. Or should only persons with a regular residence status have full entitlement to care? Applying this criterion would exclude refugees in a country such as Germany. Limiting entitlements and access to healthcare according to residence status demotes health from a human right to a citizen's right. This second normative position, health as a citizen's right, reflects the current legal situation in Germany and in many other countries with regard to refugees. And again, if you take this position as a starting point, you will do a completely different type of public health research. When defining health as a citizen's right, one would consider access to health citizens and refugees as a necessary reality and as being of no particular research interest. Only when defining health as a human right, then investigating access barriers and their health consequences becomes a priority. And if such differences indeed exist, then they should be decried as unacceptable inequalities or even inequities and eliminated. Let me illustrate this with some empirical data. As you saw from the table in my first slide, Germany is an immigration country. And you can see this here. This figure shows you the timeline from 1955, when work migration to Germany started, to 2016. The red line is the actual population of Germany. You can see that it's 82.5 million today. And the blue line here is a model. What would the German population be had there been no migration? And you can see that the country would have a population of only 71 million. On top of that, the population would be much older and presumably economically far less successful. In 2016, we had about 10 million non-German nationals residing in the country. That is between 11 and 13% of the population. A much larger proportion of the population, however, almost 1/4, either immigrated themselves or are the offspring of immigrant parents. This group I call regular immigrants here because I'm relating to their legal status. You can see that the largest group, or the two largest groups, are immigrants from Turkey, and a very peculiar group, the so-called resettlers. These are ethnic Germans who emigrated to Eastern European countries in the late 17th and 18th century and migrated after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they immediately became German citizens, but they faced similar issues as many other migrants to Germany. On top of that, as in all countries, there are irregular migrants. Nobody knows precisely how large the figure is. Estimates vary between around 200,000 and 500,000. But my focus here is on regular immigrants. Regular immigrants have the same entitlements to healthcare in Germany as the majority population via the statutory health insurance that we have. However, they face language-related and cultural access barriers to care. Acknowledging that these barriers exist and attempting to remove these barriers is a relatively recent achievement. Even years after labor migration to Germany started in the mid-1950s, immigrants were called guest workers, assuming that they were only temporal members of German society. It turned out that this was not the case, but that they stayed on. And at that time, guest workers were ascribed specific diseases, implying that these people did not fit into the German healthcare system. In other words, the German doctors did not understand the symptoms that were presented to them, and they found derogatory terms such as morbus bosporus from people coming from Turkey, when they did not understand what disease or what symptoms the patients tried to explain to them. So for decades, there was no research agenda trying to identify possible deficiencies of the healthcare system. It was all the fault of the immigrants, but the healthcare system did not have the introspection to find out whether there was something wrong within the healthcare system, resulting in poor health outcomes among immigrants. A change in this normative agenda occurred only very slowly, and the political agenda change became visible in Germany only around the year 2000, when a commission was set up, the so-called Süßmuth Commission, who published a report called Shaping Immigration, Promoting Integration in the year 2001. And this was a revolution, because for the first time, German politicians were talking about Germany as an immigration country, 45 years after immigration had in fact started. So this was a missed opportunity. Only at around that time, the first health report dedicated to immigrants was commissioned by the Robert Koch Institute, our National Institute of Public Health. So again, it took decades after the onset of labor migration until it became more widely noticed among public health researchers, and it became unacceptable among politicians that important data were lacking. Data to establish, for example, whether or not access to healthcare was equitable for subgroups of the German population, in this case for immigrants, and what the health consequences of such inequities were. Since then, there has been progressively more public health research confirming that immigrants face cultural and language barriers towards care. I brought you one example here. This is from inpatient rehabilitative care after a severe illness, cancer, for example, or after an accident. And this is based on a secondary data analysis. These data would have been available for decades, but nobody took the time or effort to analyze them. They show that regular immigrants have around 30% higher risk of failed access to rehabilitation after adjusting for socio-demographic variables. And for those immigrants who actually manage to access rehabilitation, they experience a 20% higher chance of failure of rehabilitation, meaning their chance is higher of no longer being able to work in their previous job in spite of rehabilitation. So a poorer outcome compared to non-immigrants. And these differentials cannot be explained by lower socioeconomic status or by worse health before rehabilitation. So it is language barriers, culturally unaccepted treatment procedures, and staff who are not trained in managing diversity. These are the factors that have been shown to contribute. And you can see here that this is obviously yet another missed opportunity, because it took 50 years before somebody looked at this and started to think about how to improve. The good news is such access barriers can be overcome. And the second example that I'm going to show you is from obstetrica. And the access barriers can be overcome provided that there are people who notice that such barriers exist and that efforts are made to adjust services and make them more migration sensitive. In the Berlin perinatal study, we collected primary data covering 7,100 consecutive births in Berlin, the capital of Germany. And you can see that a considerable proportion of deliveries in Berlin are among women with a migration background. Actually, it's more than half. So this is what I call the new normality. What you can also see is that the outcomes are equal or even better among immigrant women compared to non-immigrant women. I've brought you one example here, and this is the example of preterm deliveries. And you can see that among migrants of the first generation, women who migrated themselves, and the second generation, offspring of parents who came to Germany, that the proportion of preterm birth is actually lower than among non-migrant women. And this persists after controlling for age, parity, school attendance, smoking, body mass index, and so on. This is just one outcome. We looked at many other outcomes, and the picture is always or almost always the same. So better outcomes for women with a migration background compared to the majority population. It's only a small group of high-risk women with a short duration in Germany which could not be reached well by the existing services. So here you can see that it is possible to adjust services in such a way that they cater for the needs of a migrant population. So it took decades, but now a normative agenda has been set that is widely accepted. It grants that regular immigrants should have the same entitlements and the same access to healthcare as non-immigrants in Germany. By now, there is public health research in line with this agenda, for example, investigating differentials in access. And if such differentials are found, they are perceived as unfair, and efforts are made to eliminate them. The situation is quite different, however, for persons entering Germany not as regular immigrants, but as refugees. I will say a few words about the numbers and the restricted access to healthcare that refugees face. And I will then come back to the normative agendas and ask why so little and rather narrow research has been conducted relating to refugees. In 2015, the number of refugees seeking shelter in Germany and in other European countries increased substantially, fueled by armed conflicts in the Near and Middle East. And in 2015, almost 900,000 people entered Germany and close to 477,000 claimed asylum. Now, 477,000 sounded like a very high number at that time, but this figure is not unprecedented. As you can see on my time axis here, in 1992, we already had about 436,000 persons claiming asylum. This was at the time when former Yugoslavia collapsed. So we are not dealing with an entirely new phenomenon. However, back then, in 1992, no efforts were made to improve healthcare for refugees because it was thought at that time that this was a unique event and that something like this would never happen again, which for some time was the case, but then changed dramatically. Refugees and asylum seekers face language barriers and cultural access barriers, just like any other regular immigrant. In addition, Germany restricts their entitlement to healthcare. Now it's going to be a bit complicated, but what I'm going to show you is that this is also a way of governance making things complicated, and we can then discuss about the agenda. According to Article 4 of the Asylum Seekers Benefit Act, which was introduced in 1993, refugees are entitled to care only for acute conditions and during pregnancy and childbirth for the first 15 months in Germany. In other words, no treatment for chronic conditions, full stop. And asylum seekers face additional specific access barriers. On top of these entitlement restrictions, they need to obtain a health voucher before they can see a doctor. And this health voucher is issued by non-medical staff at some social services office before they can actually be treated. Some federal states in Germany have introduced an electronic health card. That's the EHC here, the electronic health card, which makes the health vouchers unnecessary. But the entitlement restrictions remain, no matter whether you have an electronic health card or a voucher. Besides Article 4 of the Asylum Seekers Benefit Act, there's also an Article 6. And this Article 6 actually offers an escape route from the entitlement restrictions, provided that the physician treating asylum seekers knows how to interpret it. Physicians here need to be lawyers as a second profession, and that the physician takes the effort to apply for an exception from Article 4 for their patients. If you find this confusing, it certainly is. And of course it is confusing for the refugees. Ultimately, entitlement and access to care are contingent on the city or county an asylum seeker is assigned to, and to the commitment of the treating physician. There had been a window of opportunity to change this in the year 2015 and to remove this overly complex regulation, but this was missed. I come back to why it may have been missed. Before 1993, asylum seekers received healthcare just like regular immigrants and like citizens in need of welfare transfers. After 1993, after all these restrictions were introduced, there was no research on the effect of these restrictions on the health of refugees. So research that was being done was largely restricted or limited to collecting prevalence data on infectious diseases, often with the idea that these infectious diseases might pose a risk to the majority population, and sometimes of psychological illness among asylum seekers. But there was hardly any health systems research investigating, for example, the health consequences of the entitlement restrictions that were put in place, or research on continuity of treatment for cases of infectious disease found during screening on arrival of a refugee. So the normative agenda underlying this kind of research work was obviously the one considering health as a citizen's right and not as a human right. Health systems research might have yielded relevant findings already years ago. This happens only now. I'll show you one example. Proponents of these entitlement restrictions used to defend their position, used to defend these entitlement restrictions, citing the belief that it would be too costly to remove these restrictions and allow refugees access to healthcare like any other person in the country. There is now scientific evidence that shows that this is completely wrong and that restricting entitlement to care for asylum seekers is actually more expensive than granting regular access. I'm not going to go into the technical details. What you see here again is the timeline here from 1995 to 2015. And you can see the green dots, and these are for refugees who had unrestricted access to healthcare, so the same entitlements as anybody else in the population. And you can see here the cost of treating refugees with entitlement restrictions in place. This was a kind of natural experiment because over time the policies changed so frequently that these comparisons could be done. And the total cost excess due to entitlement restrictions, so these are the red dots and line, compared to non-restrictions amount to a mind-boggling 1.56 billion euro. So if I calculate correctly, this is 1,200 billion CLP over the 20-year observation period. So this is an incredible increase in cost due to the restrictions as compared to regular access. Entitlement restrictions are costly in monetary terms, but the question is, do they also have consequences for the health of the asylum seekers? And this we still do not know. There still is no systematic health data collection during the first 15 months of residence. We had proposed to set up a Sentinel-type data collection system in selected health facilities all over the country. And the Ministry of Health had signaled willingness to fund the project, but it took over a year before some meager funding materialized. So this project has started, but hasn't yet produced data. So again, the underlying normative agenda, here the agenda among politicians, seems to be one of health as a citizen's right rather than a human right. It's a bit surprising, but normative agendas that may seem contradictory do coexist in practice. And Germany is a good example for that. The German government subscribes to the UN Declaration of 1948, which defines the best possible health and access to health care as an inalienable human right. The World Health Organization, as you've already heard today, promotes universal health coverage as a strategy for operationalizing this right and for achieving equity in health. So by definition, universal health coverage is not restricted to developing countries. It applies everywhere in the world. And Germany has explicitly subscribed to universal health coverage in its 2013 Global Health Strategy. This has two implications. First, health and access to healthcare is not only a citizen's right, it is a human right. So this right ought to apply to all population groups, also to all population groups in Germany, which includes asylum seekers. Germany's actual political emphasis on universal health coverage, however, is directed at closing the gap between rich and poor countries. For example, by introducing health insurance in India, which of course is commendable. But it is a narrow interpretation of this concept of universal health coverage. So universal health coverage is not applied to closing equity gaps within Germany. Yet from the universal health coverage perspective, resident status should not be a defensible criterion for restricting entitlement to health. Equal entitlements for migrants and refugees can not only be afforded, it can also be achieved. And you can see this from the Migration Integration Policy Index, which is a summary score of various aspects of access to healthcare. And here you see a large number of countries. So this is topped by countries such as New Zealand and Switzerland. You can see the EU countries, Italy, UK, Austria, Sweden, and so on, in blue. You can see the new EU countries down here in green. They're not doing as well. And you can see that Germany is only rank 23 out of 36 countries. So other countries do considerably better, putting into practice more elements of a human rights approach to refugees. When you talk to German politicians, they rarely question the citizens' right perspective. So they are completely caught in this idea that we're talking about health as a citizen right. And if they think about it in broader terms, they don't act upon it. Members of parliament of the governing parties told me in a meeting that they personally believe refugees should be granted full entitlement to health care. But they had no intention to change the restrictive Article 4 of the Asylum Seekers Benefit Act. And the reason they forwarded was that they were far too worried about losing voters to right-wing populist parties if they did so. Second, the argument of universality suggests that we ought to extend our view of refugee health beyond the nation-state container. If one assumes a global health perspective, then universal health coverage applies not only to asylum seekers in one's own country, it also extends to war-torn countries and refugees on the move. When taking up this normative position, public health researchers and practitioners cannot ignore that thousands of people receive hardly any health care during transit to the countries they are fleeing from persecution. Let me sum up. The migration regimes that politicians in well-off countries promote have for a long time been ahistorical and short-sighted. The health policies they have proposed were largely focused on their own nation states. This is changing a little bit, but even today, politicians, for example in Germany, respond with social closure and often with physical closure of borders when there are refugee movements, allegedly in response to what their electorate wants or to economic necessities. Scientists and practitioners in public health could advance a more global and a more equitable view of human society. And the main points of such a view could be, first of all, human beings are of equal worth. They are of equal merit and they are of equal dignity, no matter where they come from or how economically successful they are. One small step is to insist that equal access to healthcare is not only a citizen's right, but a human right that applies also to immigrants and to refugees in all countries. Researchers also need to become aware that their research is not neutral. We as public health researchers inevitably take decisions. What aspects we research, but also what aspects we refrain from researching. And I showed you some examples of what German researchers have missed to research, sometimes for decades. Second, a global social protection mechanism is required. It should ensure that people's basic needs for a decent living are met everywhere. So far, we have embarrassingly little to show in terms of global solidarity. And this lack of global solidarity, of course, also leads to increases in migration movements and increases in refugee movements. And third, we need to develop a vision of how societies will change and will develop in our age of migration. Eventually, there should be something like global migration governance, ensuring fair chances of migration and safe routes. Countries such as Germany lack convincing medium-term plans for integrating migrants and refugees, in spite of the demographic need for migration movements, in spite of the obvious economic advantages of migration movements, in spite of the inevitability of migration movements, and the associated societal challenges. So you can see that indeed there are immense challenges ahead. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias.